Mr. Peter Singer, thank you very much for sitting with us today. You've written a great book, Wired for War, The Robotics Revolution of the 21st Century. I think it's one of the best books that talks about the post-human warfare, if you will. I wanted to talk to you about and see if you can expand on the premise of post-human or a pilot-less or a people-less warfare.
I think what we have going on with these robotics is that many of the things from science fiction are starting to play out in battlefield reality. For example, with unmanned systems. When the U.S. started the Iraq War, it had a handful of these drones. It now has 7,000 in the inventory. On the ground, it went in with 0 unmanned ground robotics. It now has 12,000. And this is just the start. These are the very first generation of these systems. But it's also not just an American phenomena. There's 43 countries working on military robotics right now, from large countries like a Russia, like a China, to smaller countries like a Singapore, like an Israel, and of course countries in South Asia like India and Pakistan. What we have going on here is a revolution, almost like the introduction of gunpowder to warfare, atomic weapons, the computer. And it's creating all sorts of ripple effects in not only how people fight, but it's forcing us to ask new questions about what's ethical, what's legal, what's right or wrong, how should you be using these systems, and even more so, it's changing the very experience of many of those who go to war. But you use the phrase post-human, and I think that's one thing we need to be mindful of, is that on one hand, the future of war is involving more and more of these machines, for example, the strikes we've seen into Pakistan recently, but also war is still driven by our human failings, and all the ripple effects reflect our human politics, our human psychology. And then of course the future of war may be more machines, but it's also more insurgency, more terrorism. So it's both science fiction but our political reality coming together.
Right, and the fact that the person who's actually firing, dropping these bombs is sitting thousands of miles away, there's a both social and psychological impact of that as well. What did you find from talking to these people who actually man these pilotless warfares, if you will?
Well, the way to think about it is the very phrase going to war, what it means to go to war, is changing in our lifetime. So it used to mean when you went to war, for example, my grandfather fought in World War II, and that meant when he went to war, he went to a place where there was such danger that he might never come home again. Family might never see him again. You compare that experience of going to war to what a Predator drone pilot experiences. Their experience of going to war is they wake up in the morning, they get in their car, they drive to work, they sit down at a computer screen, they fly a plane for 12 hours, they're dropping missiles on targets, killing people, and then at the end of that day, they get back in their car, they drive home, and within 20 minutes after being at war, they're talking to their children about their schoolwork. And so it's a very different meaning of the whole idea of being at war. But we also see this breakdown, of course, among insurgencies. You know, what does it mean for an insurgent to go to war? Half the day they might be running their shop, they might be you know, working in their fields, and then the other half of the day they're planting an IED or launching an ambush. And then of course, after doing that, they also can go back and talk to their kids about their schoolwork. And so we have this breakdown going on in our concept of war itself. And I think all of us need to really wrestle with this, what it means and what are the laws around it.
Yeah, I remember hearing, I think from in one of your previous interviews, about $1,000 drone, or what is that?
They're one of the most popular drones that the U.S. uses in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Raven drone. Well, a magazine editor here in the U.S. has figured out how to build its equivalent for $1,000 US. And so we get into this very strange world where, for example, in the book, there's two groups that appear that have used drones that you would never expect. One was a group of college students who raised money to do something about the genocide in Darfur. They entered into negotiations with a private military company for the rental of drones. They're college kids. There's also a darker side of this. We've seen organizations like Al-Qaeda explore their interest in using drones. And that opens up a whole new area when it comes to terrorism, because you can accomplish things that maybe previously would have had to use a suicide bomber. And it doesn't have the culling power of suicide bombing. Another way to think about this is you don't have to persuade a robot that it's going to be received by 70 virgins in heaven to persuade it to blow itself up. it also gives you a distance in terms of your reach. And it's one of these darker things we have to think about. We also may see even more people turning to terrorism because of these new technologies, the anger that it causes. One of the things that also concerns me in particular, particularly as it relates to Pakistan, is the impact of technology on the so-called war of ideas. That is, we may be talking about machines, but they're playing out in our very human world. So what is the message we think we are sending when we use these machines versus what is the message that's being received? And one of the people I met with for the book was this very senior Bush administration official. And he described how he thought the message that people were receiving in the Middle East and in South Asia was that they would be intimidated by these technologies, that they would be scared by it. But that's a very different story when you meet with people in Lebanon or people in Pakistan or Iraq. And in fact, I remember one of the news editors I met with in Lebanon is one of their leading, he's the editor of their largest newspaper. He talked about how, no, it makes you look like cowards. You're sending out machines to fight for you. And so you have this disconnect between the message you think you're sending and the message that's being received. And it's something that either side, they're not aware of, that disconnect. It's a concerning thing we have to pay attention to.
Absolutely. And talking about both the perception and technology, Pakistan requested that the drone technology be transferred to Pakistan. So when there's an attack in future, Pakistan takes onus and responsibility. And I think there's two things. Number one is technology, and number two is how do you manage the perception of the people, right? What do you think about that?
Well, a couple things to say on that. The first is the idea of taking ownership and responsibility. And we shouldn't just focus in on the machine itself. We also have to take ownership and responsibility for the situation on the ground. That is, what spurred the rise of these various insurgent groups, and are we doing enough to stop these various terrorist groups? And I think that's something that we've seen many governments, including both the U.S. and the Pakistani government, take different policies at different times, and now we're sort of reaping the harvest, the bad harvest of that. The second is taking responsibility of what you're actually doing. I mean, we've seen the news recently that, you know, we've gone from seeing the Pakistani government condemning these attacks, and then it turned out, oh my gosh, they were actually based in Pakistan the whole time. So that's also an issue of taking responsibility. I think we need to have more transparency about this. The third thing is, though, these weapons, they offer great capabilities. Look, 11 out of the top 20 Al-Qaeda leaders that have been killed via these drones. But regardless of who's operating them, be it an American, be it a Pakistani, you still have to ask yourself, how do I balance the short-term advantage of these strikes versus the long-term impact on not only American-Pakistani relations, but also more broadly on the sentiments of that public in that community, in that village, in that province where it's taking place. So it's really, to me, it's not just merely who's driving the drone, it's does that drone strike make sense? There may be certain situations where it makes sense, where you have a leader of Al-Qaeda who's plotting an attack, and this is the best way to get him. But we shouldn't be overly cavalier. We shouldn't be trying to do these in each and every single instance. And that's one of the things that's concerned me. I've seen the number of these attacks have just gone up greatly in the last year. And I'm not certain that all of them may have met that need. And I think that's a question for both the American government and the Pakistani government, because it's very clear we have been in more cooperation and coordination on this than most people have wanted to say.
Well, thank you very much. And on that note, I would basically thank you for your time, and it's a great book. Hopefully our audience will read it as well.
Well, thank you very much.